relative own introductions, but we'll really be touching on a little bit of the view of the value of RECs or the market size, carbon versus RECs, the legal considerations, the schemes out there, the REC registry. Jason will be talking to that. And then how do we use environmental attributes to achieve net zero? And Robbie Louw from Prometheum will be speaking through those. For your information, I'm Rob Futter, Executive Director of Cresco. Very involved in the energy sector at the moment, to be honest, primarily working for the buyers of power who have set very aggressive renewable energy targets. And scope 1, scope 2, and now increasingly focus on scope 3 emissions, and therefore the environmental attributes or impacts of environmental attributes are really important from that process. We did a bunch of webinars last year, and these are listed on the screen, and should any of these be of interest, they are available on Cresco's website and linkages and that. Some of them I still believe are up to date and relevant, where some, specifically maybe the Eskom long-term pricing views and some things on the multi-market model, have now been overtaken over time. So what I should have said at the beginning of the webinar was that please keep your cameras off unless you're a speaker, and on mute. And if you would mind, if you do have questions, please post them in the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, we will work through the questions. I will just be the facilitator, and we'll ask you either to come online and ask your question, or we'll respond accordingly based on who is there. We're not using the fancy Zoom one today. It's more of an interactive session, but thank you very much again for joining us. So we did a bunch of webinars earlier this year. We did the Megaflex changes with Shirley in June, or changes to the wheeling with Shirley and Keith. We launched a business yesterday through Chris Yellen's Orion sort of bigger platform called Orion, which Cresco is involved in, which is an asset management business along with ED Platform and Harmerton. We unfortunately had to cancel or postpone, should I say, until hopefully October, the engagement with the Eskom distribution team on call it movement from traditional to different wheeling options. And today we're talking about the environmental attributes of renewable energy. Apologies, I should have had my camera on. Too much going on this side. Thank you very much. So this is really a follow-up webinar to one we did with Jason last year, where we talked about the value of green electrons. And I think what's interesting is how the world has moved since then. Cresco has actually purchased some RECs. We went and purchased some renewable energy certificates from RCL's Pongola Sugar Mill, and we actually presented them at AEF last year and this year. And I think that the level of interest and the value ascribed to these RECs is increasing as people are perhaps requiring these environmental attributes to be used for various purposes. I know we've seen an interest and an increase from some of our clients with running more diesel engines, perhaps, versus renewable offsets. And what are they doing with that? So I think this is, Jason will touch on a lot of what's changed from last year to this year, which I think will be of interest to many people. And I think the renewable energy certificates itself are linked very much to this whole idea of renewable energy penetration. And I think people have seen this slide before, but the idea of just having a single target has now moved from a 100% renewable target or a theoretical target to this idea of 24/7 carbon-free electricity. And Google went out with much enthusiasm in 2017 and said, we've achieved 100% renewables. And a lot of people said, well, if you need 100 megawatt hours and you bought 100 megawatt hours, that theoretically is true, but not technically true, because you wouldn't have achieved that in every time of use bucket or every hour of the day. So they went back and did an energy audit. And as you can see from this picture in the middle, the data centers demand, and that is we have quite high penetration levels in the Great Lakes area, and pretty poor penetration levels, I think, similar to South Africa, in the southern states, which are largely using fossil fuels. So this concept of 24/7 carbon-free energy and using a pretty clock is very much at play. And I think the actual split of the clock here works very nicely in the South African context, because at the moment we mostly have PV projects. There are wind generally, but at least in the private sector space, we primarily see a lot more PV projects available, which are really only going to offset this part of the day. We have the movement towards perhaps PV and BESS projects that will offset the early morning and the evening. And at the moment, we really have no material technologies, without perhaps some imported hydro run of river is limited to actually really offset the other side. And I think this is also quite important for RECs. From my understanding is that over time, the value of the RECs will also depend on when it's generated. At the moment, I think it's generated any time of the day, but just like energy will become valuable in terms of the time of the day, I believe the value of the environmental attributes, at least if we use that term, will become more valuable depending on when it is required, due to obviously the typical demand-supply imbalance. So this is really a lot of the work we've been doing for our clients, and we talked about what we do in 21, 22, 22, 23, 23, 24, and now increasingly more focus on 24, 25. Started off with off-site wheeling, then on-site generation, moving into energy strategy work, moving into sort of new technologies or cogeneration BESS, and then we've just started on renewable energy certificates as their current form, and I think that was very much linked to the webinar that we did with Jason last year. We started talking about carbon offsets, started talking about ESG, but not really meaningful movement there. We've then seen the jump towards perhaps cross-border wheeling, and wheeling being security supply consideration, so that's quite interesting. And then a remarkable movement in terms of the focus on carbon and RECs. Perhaps not all of these projects are being implemented as yet, but definitely from a feasibility point of view, the value ascribed to them is becoming more important. And then moving on towards what we see going forward is increasing use of BESS. And then now what do we do with the excess energy, balancing charges, time of use, which is not the purpose of today's discussion, but it does show how the market is moving so quickly. And similarly, my view is that the environmental attributes market will move at a pace in the same way. At the moment, I believe there's not a lot of regulation. It's largely being pulled together from various sources. There will come a stage where I think there'll be rules for all, but in the meantime, there's definitely be a marked movement. And just like the wheeling regime has moved pretty quickly, I think in this space, we'll see similar developments moving forward. So same idea in terms of where we were. So in the background, we have this fully functioning market around wheeling. So many so cogeneration deals have been wheeled for a number of years. We've got the bigger Sasol, Tronox, Sibanye deals happening. We now see the move towards battery storage linked to the projects coming in. Now longer duration storage coming through to the market, the work we're doing, and then pushing forward into the sort of the day ahead market, and eventually a fully liberalized market, which may include the SAP. And I guess the question is, how would the inclusion of SAP affect the environmental attributes in the South African market, considering that a lot of the generation north of the border has high environmental benefits, being hydro-based, maybe not Botswana with the other ones, and I'm sure that will create some impact, at least on grid emissions and all that sort of stuff. So it's starting to become very interesting in terms of how it's not just South Africa alone, but how the market as a whole is starting to develop. In addition to that, the question is, what do we do with the excess energy, or what do we do with the environmental attributes of the excess energy? So, what we've seen here is a nice solution where we're pushing for 60% penetration. Maybe for many people, this is your second round of renewable procurement. So we have a large bit of solar, and if you're lucky enough to get some wind, it works quite nicely. And when we have small sort of excess energy situations there. But if you start looking at other technologies, this excess energy can become much higher. And over here we have a PV plus potentially over time an imported hydro solution for a small load, and therefore the excess energy is a lot more pronounced. It is a lot more less regular over the year. And what does that mean to the people selling this excess energy and perhaps the people buying this excess energy around its environmental attributes? And who gets access to that? Because in our experience, when people want renewable energy, they also want all the environmental attributes associated with that, because they're offsetting their various targets internally. And I guess this is for us, both on the wheeling side and a price side, becoming very relevant, but on the environmental attribute side and the pricing of that also, in my view, also relevant from that point of view. In addition to that, we have how big is the market? And we've been using this slide a few times. So this is Anchor Capital presentation that was part of an RMB presentation that talks to the notional capacity or nominal capacity installed in South Africa. And we can see the REAP programs, working towards about 11,000 megawatts hopefully 25, 26. And then private IPPs, according to them, being in place by 2025. Cresco's view is grid constraints and just taking longer to get to financial close will mean it'll only happen in 2027, 28. And then the small scale rooftop is 6,000. So from that point of view, there's going to be potentially 6 of installed capacity. Apologies, I had a bit of a glitch thing from there. So can you hear me again, Vumi? Apologies, I had a internet glitch.
You're back, Rob.
Vumi, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Can anyone hear me on the screen?
Yes, I can hear you. Fine.
We can hear you, Rob.
Hi, Vumile, can you hear me? Am I
We
back
lost
up?
you.
We can
You're
hear
back
you now,
up.
Rob.
We
Yes,
lost
Hear me now?
you
yes,
for a
Rob.
Thank you.
second.
Sorry, apologies. I had a bit of an internet shuffle. The World Cup is taking too much bandwidth in Europe. Apologies. So we have then potentially 16,000 megawatts of private generation potentially being installed by 2027, 28, which is nearly 60% versus the REAP. And this itself will have a significant value attached to it from an environmental attribute point of view. So at the moment, what we've seen is, the value of RECs, and Jason, you can correct me, my data is a little bit more out of date, is between 3.5 cents or 5 cents per kilowatt hour accordingly, but we see that is moving materially. And in the EU, we see that moving to 0.7 US cents or even 6.5 euros. So the numbers are starting to grow exponentially. And what we see from a lot of the Cresco work is that over time, with Eskom actually adjusting their megaflex tariffs, the cost of wheeling increasing, transmission losses changing, increasing, that the real value of renewables will actually largely sit in the environmental attributes that are relevant from that. And that, to a certain extent, will reset a lot of the lost savings that we've seen coming out of the fact that the savings on pure wheeling deals have reduced. Cool. So I think that is my presentation. So apologies for the little interruption on the internet, but I'm going to hand over to Andrew Gilder, who will talk about some of the legal definitions and that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Robert. So is somebody going to move the slides?
Yes, I will do that
please?
for you, Andrew.
Good.
Yeah.
So go ahead. So actually, thanks, Robert. I'm not going to speak particularly to the slides. I was never intending to do that, but some of the things that you've said actually caused me to kind of extemporize a little bit. But let's go into the slides very briefly. So go to the next slide, please. The colleagues, the broad thrust of these slides, there are 10 or so of them, and they unpack, I suppose, a really important and fundamental understanding of the renewable energy certificate versus the carbon credit. But one can summarize that fundamental understanding very simply, which is a carbon credit is not a renewable energy certificate. They are different things. These slides give an idea of the distinction between them. You might be able to argue from a theoretical perspective that they can both coexist within a single renewable energy project, but that would merely be a theoretical discussion because it's very highly unlikely that the market would want to buy carbon credits and renewable energy certificates that derive from the same flow of renewable energy. I'm willing to debate and discuss any of these statements in the Q&A. The third thing I'd like to say is that because they are different things and because the South African carbon tax legal regime speaks to project-based carbon credits when it talks about using a carbon offset against a carbon tax liability, that means that certainly at the moment, a renewable energy certificate is not something that can be used to reduce a carbon tax liability from within the carbon tax legal regime. So you can't generate or purchase renewable energy certificates and retire them against a carbon tax liability in the same way that you can do that with carbon credits, provided those carbon credits comply with the requirements under the carbon offset regulations. That's all I want to say in terms of what these slides present. And clearly we're going to share the slides, and there's slightly more detailed information in the slides. But Robert, I'd like to pick up a couple of things that you pointed out.
So before, sorry, Andrew, we
yes,
jump straight into it. Do you mind popping on your camera and maybe just giving us 1 minute on your background so we give some credibility to your strong statements?
Lovely. So my camera is on from my side. I can see
brilliant.
myself.
Okay.
If I wave, can I be seen? So good, thank you.
There we go. There we go.
No,
So maybe
fine.
just a quick intro. You jump straight into debating things. So thank you.
Of course I did,
But,
because I love this stuff. So first of all, I see a number of familiar names and colleagues in the participation list. So great, excellent, wonderful to see some of you. Some of you I haven't spoken to for a while. So excellent to know you're still in the game. So I'm a climate change and carbon markets lawyer. From the carbon perspective, actually from both of those perspectives, I've been doing this for 20 years this year. Robbie, Louw, and I actually were in a meeting yesterday where we looked at each other and went, we've been doing this almost for exactly the same length of time, since about 2002 or 3. I get involved in climate change law actually initially through a carbon credit project. And so I suppose, if anything, the carbon market predates very slightly my work in the climate change law space. And so the last point I made, there are a number of things that we've done, but I suppose that the thing that we're most proud of, and I'll explain what I mean by we, is we drafted the South African Climate Change Bill, certainly the version of the bill that was published in July 2018. That bill, still very substantially the document that we produced more than 5 years ago now, is formally Bill 9 of 2022, which is before Parliament. It has been before Parliament since February last year, but there are some good indications that we will have a Climate Change Act, if not before the end of this year. Let me muse on that. I think government would be very interested and very happy to be able to go to the COP this year, waiving a Climate Change Act before it. So possibly we'll see some action on that before the end of the year. But if not, then I expect that we'll see climate change legislation early next year. That's really quite important for the carbon market in the country and for regulation around greenhouse gas emissions, because the Act anticipates finally the formal implementation of what for many years government has been talking about as its post 2020. I guess it will now be the post 2022 mitigation system, which is a fairly ambitious and 6-component system of administration and regulation, all intended to interlock and work together, which deals with the question of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. When I say we, I'm talking about Climate Legal, which is a boutique 2-person climate change and carbon markets specialist firm. Rob, I suspect I've used a fair amount of time already, but I'm going to...
No, I think, so I mean, you mentioned 2 points from my presentation you wanted to touch on, and then I have one question for you. So touch on those 2 points, and then I have one question, and then we can move on to Jason here.
Sure. So let me pick up the points that you made, and I will do that by speaking about how our practice has evolved and is evolving really quite rapidly over about the last since about 2019, let's say. So let's go back that far, which is quite a long time in the carbon market. So in 2019, with the implementation of the carbon tax, we saw a really interesting moment for the South African carbon market, because for the first time we saw regulated at a national level a carbon price and demand and supply indicators for carbon credits. So what that meant was that from June, effectively 2019, the South African carbon market has been insulated from the vagaries of the international market. And that's been good for a number of us who work in the space, because we've seen the growth of a strong market, and which continues to grow and will continue to grow. What is very interesting in that context is that prior to government, I'm going to use that word broadly, because the carbon tax, of course, originally is driven by Treasury, implemented by SARS. But the Carbon Tax Act was really interesting, I suppose, philosophically, because it gave an indication of government's willingness to work in the carbon market space and to use a market mechanism to deal with what in many instances is still considered to be merely an environmental problem. So in this instance, the problem is emissions of greenhouse gases. So it's not an environmental problem by any stretch of the imagination. It's primarily a financial problem. But it was very interesting that government took that action, because it presages a number of future developments within the regulatory and the commodity space that we are involved in. We are seeing moving quite rapidly now. So one of those is the government's grasping of the opportunity being presented under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So we are in the process currently, and in collaboration with Prometheum, we are preparing an Article 6 framework for the country, which implies dealing with the future carbon market. We are also doing some work at the moment for the National Treasury, which I think will finally see a greater level of oversight and regulation of the carbon market from the financial perspective. So I think Treasury is very interested in what the market offers, and I think we'll seek to intervene in the market in ways that we haven't seen before, and that's a good thing, because we will have much more clarity around the market and financial instruments within the market. It's worth saying that the Treasury, the piece of work we're doing for Treasury, is driven by Treasury's interest in giving greater levels of confidence to banks to invest and provide financing for carbon projects. Last thought from me, and then your question, Robert. The other thing that we have seen in our practice over the last number of years, and that's why the present discussion is dealing with both carbon credits and renewable energy certificates. So the other thing we've seen is the rise of interest in the market in renewable energy certificates. And that's partly driven by two factors. The first one is, some years ago, the Verified Carbon Standard, or VERA, decided that it was no longer going to allow large-scale grid-connected renewable energy projects as carbon credit generators. So that reduced the level of interest from the carbon perspective. But at the same time, and I have to say, and kudos goes to Jason here, largely, I suppose, driven by Jason's efforts and the efforts of other players in the renewable energy certificate space, the viability and the value of RECs as not an alternative commodity to a carbon credit, but another commodity that can be considered in the financing of renewable energy projects. The value of RECs and the importance of RECs has become front and center. And so just to give one example, we were asked to do, the Energy Intensive Users Group asked us to do an analysis of the contracting documentation underpinning the IPP project program rounds 1 to 6, to look particularly at the question of, could it be determined on the basis of those contracts? So primarily the power purchase agreements and the implementation agreements, whether it could be determined where ownership of the renewable energy certificate lay within the IPP context. So really important and consequent discussions being had, as I guess they've always been had, around carbon market and now the REC market. Robert, you had a question for me.
Cool. No, thank you. And I think you've just created more questions and answers from that. But I think that's
Excellent.
the purpose of this webinar.
I'm a consultant. This is what I do.
Exactly. So we have to do lots of crystal ball gazing. Tell us what Eskom's going to do. Tell us how Megaflex is going to change. Tell us day ahead prices, all that sort of stuff. And as you've mentioned, at the moment, you cannot use RECs to offset your carbon tax.
Correct.
So the question is, do we believe that will happen? And when do we believe that might happen?
May I ask Jason to deal with that, because it's a conversation he's specifically having.
Okay, brilliant. That's a nice way to answer a question, Andrew. That's easy.
Thank you. Hand it to someone else. Excellent.
Cool. Well, that then we're going to move on in terms of timing. I think your timing was perfect, and I'm going to add on to Jason, but I'm going to scroll quickly through this 100 slides you provided and didn't talk through. As we mentioned, they will be available after this. And
Good.
So now I'm
Thank
going to let Andrew Jason introduce himself. Andrew, if you want to pop off your camera, and then just Jason asked me to pop the slides as you need them. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Rob. It's good to see colleagues and friends online. Are you, just to check that you're hearing me and seeing me?
Perfect. You look a bit older than the picture we have on the previous slides, though. What's happened? No, just joking. Please continue.
You know, we work from home these days, so it affords you a certain flexibility. But Rob, thanks for having us again, and to your team for setting it up. I'll keep this brief. I'm Jason Schaffler. I manage the ZA RECs registry in South Africa, and there's been some regional activity as well, and indeed some international activity. And you'll see from the slides interaction with other schemes and markets. That's the title that we've used today. You can go to the next slide, please, Rob, or Vumi. So we've been asked to give a flavor of what's going on. So I see many people who were in the first webinar, which was more of an introductory session. The inquiries that we received to the registry still involve a lot of call it market awareness or market education. So how to participate in the market, and often more questions than answers. Thanks for the kind words, Andrew, and for the hot potato on the eligibility under the carbon tax offsets. But effective and proactive green environmental environmentally aware
your line seems quite poor. Do you want to pop your camera off? I think the connection is a bit poor. Yeah, it's flaky and that. Cool. Please continue.
Let's see if that's better. I hope so. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.
To a far more significant, you know, the RECs activity in South Africa started way back in 2002 and in earnest around 2007. So it's been at it for a long time, and the trade was rather thin. But in the last 2 to 3 years, that has accelerated significantly, and I'll give you some flavor of that as we go through these 5 or 6 slides. I think the important thing to say about RECs is just it's a relatively simple tool, you know, to guarantee the origin. Andrew had a really nice on your one slide that both methods are valid and robust ways to track and claim renewable energy production and or procurement. But it turns out that they, you know, for example, they're pushing back into the way we buy and sell physical power. So we're going from most power purchase agreements 5 years ago being largely undifferentiated, saying very little about any environmental attributes for that matter, to contracts where this is now clearly included. And the last item, the last bullet there says a tool to underpin market stimulation and choice. The very fact that in negotiations around price, for example, on power purchase agreements, that there now are clauses on environmental attributes, and their ownership, and that they have an impact on that pricing. The way we do settlement of physical power, generally the REC systems have had a higher resolution. So you've already been able to do essentially 24/7, keep track of what Rob called buckets. So each half hourly or hourly bin. And the South African ESI simply doesn't have that resolution. So if you look at the number that I've got for 2023 year to date, that's the last number that we've reported at the quarterly REXA meeting. We've moved on somewhat from that. The best year to date was 2021, and that was 480 gigawatt hours. So it's exciting, and the market is growing. It's becoming more sophisticated. I think Andrew and Robert have alluded to that, and I'm sure Robbie will also bear testimony to that. So it's growing. Next slide, please, Rob. It's vibrant. This is sort of in the eye of the beholder, a versatile and flexible mechanism. The reason that people engage in the REC market is for several reasons, I think, and it's becoming more of a financial consideration. So that choice, that market signal that comes through from customers wishing to make a claim about their renewable energy consumption, about a target that they've set, about the scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, that feeds through into how lucrative the rate of return on renewable energy projects. And so that means that the initial reason for putting this market in place was to drive renewable energy uptake. And it's had that impact. I think it continues to have that impact. But there are all sorts of almost unintended positive consequences that we find. The way that both suppliers and consumers keep track of the renewables that they use, those metrics tend to feed back into it's sort of almost old triple bottom line type thinking. So you start to think a little bit differently about your big metrics, energy efficiency, economic energy efficiency, total renewables. So this is just a very quick. Andrew said quite clearly, a REC is not a carbon credit. RECs can be used for greenhouse gas accounting, as this slide says. When we talk about attributes, the title of this presentation is environmental attributes, but there are of course multiple attributes, and you can go all the way to, a more diversified energy system means better energy and economic stability, for example. And then the concept of externalities, where this work really started, thinking about when there was still a gap between the generating fuels versus the cost of generating renewables, which of course has changed. So we're in a post-parity environment. Next slide, please, Rob. Boomy, are we still online? The slide's not. There we go. So energy attribute certificate developments. Super. Even the fact that we're now talking more broadly about energy attribute certificates, sort of the more theoretical academic definition of this. There are PhDs out there being written at the moment about EAC developments in emerging markets. I wonder if Daniel's made it online today, and when he's going to finish that PhD, if you're online, Daniel. It's because business is so good that there's no time to write it up. The reason for doing this, so I've price and volume discovery. How do you know what your renewables are worth? What is the on environmentally preferable energy worth? So even if it's a marketing, if the electric vehicle that's delivering your groceries from Wool is this vehicle is driven by 100% solar power, those are renewable energy certificates. It's a marketing. The value add is marketing addition. So it's preferable to the other retail stores who maybe are still driving around diesel-powered vehicles. I spoke about the market being vibrant, being lots of excitement. I think Robert has said the expectation is that the market will grow. The rate at which inquiries are coming through, the rate at which one of the things that we've started tracking in our own systems is the time from how RECs work to through the process, through account application, to actually transacting, to having your device, your generator register for receive, to produce RECs, to transacting, and ultimately make a claim through redemption. So 5 years ago, we were talking to people and they'd just come back 18 months later for another chat, and then a year later for another. That there are more and more entities, big corporates coming online that are saying, we need to get this done in a month from account application to final redemption. So sense of driven by, be they these initiatives that I'm talking about, Renewable Energy 100, companies putting SBT targets, initiative, validated targets in place, or indeed net zero, carbon neutral, greenhouse gas specified type targets in place. Importantly, I think it's useful to mention consolidators and aggregators. So how do we, to date, the bulk of transactions have been 1,000 megawatt hours in a transaction. Above that, the audit trail that you need to put in place, the administrative costs associated with putting that in place mean that larger transactions are more viable. But increasingly, the size on both the production and on the offtake side, new entities are entering the market to work out how, for example, you take small commercial and industrial PV aggregations to market, how you sell very small quantities. If you have a domestic electric vehicle, you use maybe 5 to 10 megawatt hours a year. If you wanted to green that, how would you do that? And also you might want to buy the energy at the time of purchasing a vehicle, for example. So it's quite tricky to transact 5 megawatt hours, and that's where new platforms and exchanges are coming into existence at a rapid rate. I see a number of them online, and you see others on the ZRX website. I think there's 15 listed under the traders tab at the moment. And the way that the registry engages with those platforms and exchanges is one of the things that we do on a daily basis. And it has a bearing on the way the domain protocol and the subsidiaries are written. How do we, for example, deal with consolidated device portfolios of PV systems? The importance of RECSA, I think, to leave with you that more and more it's been a small group of corporates, and all credit to a number of them. I think maybe biomass has been overlooked. The pulp and paper, the sugar industry have been long-time supporters of both independent power, but also of the RECS market and the impact that it can have on the ESI generally. And the reason, because this is largely a governing market, the acceding to the domain protocol and becoming a member of RECSA is very important. I mentioned, the title that I was requested to speak on was various standards and initiatives. So it can be quite confusing when you into this market. The credit side used to be 20 or 30 different standards, and that's sort of been honed down to 3 international ones that are organized by SA Gov. And similarly, on the RECS side, there's a long trail of acronyms. Again, we could probably list 20 or 30. When you're getting involved, how do you know where to start? Certainly, I would suggest RECSA probably is the place to start. ZAREX operates the South African registry on behalf of RECSA, of the market participants. And it means that all those participants have sight of the rules, have a role in maintenance of the rules and adherence to those rules. That the registry is megawatt hour of renewable energy is just that, solid. Last slide, I think, Rob.
Yeah, so Jason, I'm going to jump in here
please.
with my question, if I can. I don't know if you can hear me.
Sure.
I don't know if it's you or me, but the question around when will REX be eligible against carbon tax, if at all? Can I ask you to answer that question before we do the roundup?
I know Robbie's next. I'm tempted to pass it on, but
give us a go. Give us a view.
The discussions. I think Robbie is having those discussions, but the gist of it is that the carbon side, the creation of a local carbon standard and the approval thereof by, I think, the DMRE, the minister of the DMRE, is the big step that needs to be taken. There's a lot that's been put in place already. The timeline for that is, as usual, 6 months from now. I mean, 3 months' time, it's 6 months from now again. There's also some confusion now with the one-stop shop being put in place, whether the DTIC would be the entity, the government entity that deals with this. Robbie will know more, but the way that renewables will be brought to market, whether REX goes through, for example, there are a number of potential standards, one of which is the inclusive carbon standard. How REX will be, how renewables will be dealt with under that will be, for example, on a positive list, because it certainly isn't included under any of those other standards, or where there are programs of activities, they are already full. So
if I could paraphrase you slightly differently, because most of the projects we're working on, the things that are real scale, besides obviously this huge push into behind the meter, these projects are only be coming online in 2026. So do we think by 2026 this would have happened? And then the next question, I guess, is if you talk carbon getting closer to $100 a ton or euros a ton or whatever analyst you look at, are we going to, we obviously, with that happening, we would assume that the value of the environmental attributes at that stage could more than double, triple, and so. Is that your thinking too?
Correct. That could very well happen. It would have an impact both on volume and on the price. The price would go to the, what would it be? Not a floor price, but the cap put in place by the carbon tax. Already impacts on the way generators think about the way they're contracting for their environmental attribute certificates. Bear in mind, we generally advise to stay flexible. You know, make sure that you don't limit yourself to a single standard, for example, that if you wish to join additional standards, have your devices registered under additional standards, that your PPA doesn't preclude you from doing. Start with a ZA-REX or a REXA registration and move from there. And whether those become eligible or fungible in those markets at a later date, you know, the market can decide if that makes sense. In a way, the message that's come, there's a different of light on the REX. In a way, we're doing it in preparedness. It's a market-based initiative we're using while we're waiting. You know, we've all been playing this waiting game, waiting for the policy and legislation. But yeah, we have a little that's operational, and so use it, but be ready, be prepared. Robbie may have additional thoughts on that. If that helps. I think
touch on that.
Maybe the last slide.
I think that helps. Cool.
Maybe one more. Yeah, this is pretty general stuff. There's Robbie. The way we report, we could have fun with this slide the whole day, but the fact that we're in this post-parity environment, it means that what's happening on the grid, call it the other 85%, leave nuclear out of it for now, is not only becoming increasingly expensive purely from a financial perspective, but it's also no good in terms of greenhouse gas reporting. So it's this concept of the double whammy. You know, we know where our utilities are, where Eskom and the munis are. They're struggling. You know, even the message that we got recently: please don't run your own generation capacity because of the impacts on the grid. There's a wedge between the centralized system and this virtual, call it, remembering that the REX are both grid and off-grid compatible. And so when I talk about closing the loop, how do we make sure that the centralized system is still supported in all of this? You know, how do RECs interact with virtual wheeling? In one media article that you can compare virtual wheeling to RECs. It's a very similar thing. It's an accounting system that allows for a financial contribution to a particular generator. So I'll end there. I've also prepared a more comprehensive set of slides as a handout. So
yes, no, and that'll be
that will also help members engage. Yeah,
agreed. So all the people who've registered will receive that along with the PowerPoint. Apologies again that the sound seems to be a bit up and down, but thank you, Jason. I'm going to jump on to Robbie then. Cool. Thank you, Robbie.
Thank you.
We'll let you know with, we don't see we have much luck with IT, so I'll let you know if you have to switch off your camera, but we'll start with you if that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and hello, everybody. I see I know about half the people on the call, so for the other half, I'll just give a brief introduction. I didn't put a slide on who I am or who Prometheum is. So for the people that don't know me and Prometheum is a climate change and carbon advisory business. We're based in Johannesburg and Cape Town. We've been in this game since 2003, so it's 20 years this year. We've been very intimately involved in the development of quite a lot of the infrastructure in South Africa that relates to carbon offsets. I normally nowadays say to people, up to when the lockdown started in 2020, we were the lunatic fringe. We were the mad people that said, listen, we've got to do something about decarbonization and climate change. And when we came out of lockdown, all of a sudden, what we've been doing for 17 years up to now was mainstream. So we're not quite comfortable in the mainstream yet. But yeah, that's who we are. Robin, then before you go to the next slide that actually starts with carbon neutrality and net zero, maybe just to answer your question about the use of RECs and carbon offsets, because you're quite persistent in bugging Andrew and
it is a major financial implication for renewable projects. So
yes,
that's my question.
Yeah, so we actually started working on the options to convert RECs into carbon credits in probably about 2017. We did some work at the time that was funded by the British government, and we had an event in which we presented some results. Fundamentally, what renewable energy gives you are two things. The first is a guarantee of origin. In other words, it says what technology the energy was produced in. And secondly, it gives you a guarantee of the amount of energy that was produced. On top of that, in order to get carbon credits, you need a couple more things. You need additionality. We think that you can address the additionality through a positive list. In other words, to say that if it is this technology of this size, then it is automatically additional. And secondly, you need a baseline, and the baseline is the grid emission factor. So we have been working on the development of a South African standard, and one of the options, one of the areas in the South African standard is to then take the REC, the renewable energy certificate, as a proof of the technology and a proof of the amount of energy, and then to basically multiply that by the grid emission factor, and that would give you then the amount of carbon in tons of CO2 equivalent. The current status of that is that government has produced and is hopefully in the process of approving what's called the framework for the approval of domestic standards. The moment that framework is published by government, we will apply for the approval of this new standard. Andrew has already mentioned, we call it the Inclusive Carbon Standard, or ICS. And then when that approval happens, then hopefully the approval will be granted. We're positive that it will, because we actually tested the standard against the draft framework back in 2021 already. And then you will be able to convert the renewable energy certificates into carbon credits. The conversion rate will be the grid emission factor. At the moment, that sits at about 0.95 tons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. Thank you very much.
Cool. Then, because I've spent some time on this, I'm going to jump quickly through some of the slides and not go into too much detail. The title of this talk is Net Zero and Carbon Neutrality. This slide just gives the ISO standards, ISO 14068 standard version of carbon neutrality. I don't think we have to go into that. If there was more time, we could do it. The next slide starts talking about the diverging views about what carbon neutrality versus net zero is. Just very briefly, there's a lot of people that say carbon neutrality means this and net zero means that. At the end of the day, they're almost the same thing, and we actually use the terms interchangeably, and different people and different standards define it differently, but that's all, I think, fairly academic, so we can move on through this as well. Then there's quite a number of standards that you can use to prove net zero carbon neutral. Again, this is more background, and if we had more time, we could go deeper into it, but very, very high level. The one that's suffering from the most marketing, that is probably the most inappropriate of all, is called the Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTI net zero standard. We advise almost all of our clients to not use the standard, but it's the one that people are pressurized to use, and we can go into the detail in other offline discussions if people are interested about why the SBTI's net zero standard is in many respects fundamentally inappropriate for the South African business. There's also a standard called PAS 2060. Yeah.
But a quick question, Robbie, if I can, on this. So if we have a client who has and I'm being a bit overly simplistic here, a 30% renewable energy target, scope 2 emissions by 2026, and then simplistically that means you use 100 megawatt hours of energy, and therefore you need to offset 30, yeah, very simplistically. Would you say that under the SBTI standard versus the PAS standard, that 30 would be a different number, or is it largely defined as the same number? And I know I'm being overly simplistic, but
so the biggest difference comes in the boundary of your carbon footprint that you want to take to zero or neutral. If we just go on, I'll answer that question just now. Just give us the next slide. The next slide starts talking about carbon footprints, and the reason why this is very important, this wasn't meant to be a presentation on carbon footprints, but fundamentally your carbon footprint defines the boundary of what you include, and what's inside the boundary is what you want to set to zero. So if we go to the next slide, and I'm jumping through it very, very quickly. Everybody is, or just about everybody is familiar with the term scope 1, 2, and 3. And that comes from a very old version of the ISO standard and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And the SBTI actually forces you to go to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and use that as a carbon footprinting standard. Fundamentally, where the difference comes in is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol says that you shall report your scope 1 emissions, which is direct emissions, and you shall report your scope 2 emissions, which is energy indirect. And then it says you may report other indirect or scope 3 emissions. The SBTI's net zero standard now turned around and said that you shall also calculate very accurately all your other indirect or scope 3 emissions. That differs fundamentally from the ISO standard, which says that you shall report your direct emissions, which used to be scope 1 or now category 1. And then it says you shall do the following. You shall determine a set of significance criteria that you use to evaluate your indirect emissions. And then it says you shall quantify and report all of your significant indirect emissions. The place where this is very important in net zero and in offsetting is, for instance, you can specify as a significance criteria the level of influence, and if you've got zero influence over what happens somewhere, you can actually exclude that from your boundary, which makes your target actually feasible. Let's go to the next one. I see we've got only about 4 minutes left. And there are, this is important. This is actually what we need to talk about, is you can articulate the environmental attribute of your renewable energy in one of three ways. The first is you can sell it as zero emission electricity. The second is you can articulate it as a renewable energy certificate or REC. And the third is you can do it as carbon credits. And those are mutually exclusive. You have to pick one. You cannot double count. You cannot issue more than one. Let's go to the next slide. We've got 3 minutes, I think. This is,
I think one of them. Take a couple of minutes after the hour if there's questions. So
okay, cool. Yeah, no, we can. This is, I think, the crux of it. What you see in this slide is you see right at the top on the left-hand side, we start with the operations, your category 1 or scope 1 emissions. That's your direct emissions that goes into your emission inventory or your carbon footprint. Then we've got a block where we put in one block your purchased energy that you buy from the grid, from Eskom or municipality or wherever, and then we've got to purchase the renewable energy, and they together give you your scope 3. I mean your scope 2, your energy indirect emissions. Then when you buy renewable energy certificates, that's actually accounted for by reducing your scope 2 emissions. And that therefore reduces your total emission inventory or carbon footprint. Then we've also got your value chain or your other indirect emissions, which is your scope 3 emissions. And then the carbon offsets, you can only apply to your carbon footprint. And the fundamental reason in that is that your carbon footprint is actually articulated in tons of CO2 equivalent, and the standards do not allow you to deduct that prior to calculating your carbon footprint, whereas your renewable energy certificates is actually a representation of the origin of your electricity, and therefore you can bring that into your scope 2 calculation. So this difference in treating the different environmental attributes in terms of the way in which you articulate your environmental attribute, this I think is fundamentally important, and people need to understand this. The next slide then just talks about the requirements, your power purchase agreement. This is my last slide. But basically, I don't think we should go through the detail of it, but this is this comes out of a set of criteria called the quality criteria that sits in a document called the Scope 2 Guidance Document of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The people who are interested, it's very important that your power purchase agreements must satisfy the requirements of the quality criteria. Historically, this has not been that important because there wasn't so much commercial value associated with the environmental attributes. And a lot of people who've been auditing your carbon footprints have not given attention to it. But with the increasing economic and commercial value that's placed on the environmental attribute, this is becoming very important. So we've seen a lot of historic carbon power purchase agreements that do not satisfy the requirements of these quality criteria. Just about everybody that is doing business today is using the Scope 2 guidance document for their greenhouse gas accounting. And if your power purchase agreement does not satisfy the requirements of the quality criteria, then you are going to get to a point where auditors of your carbon footprint is going to stand up and say, you do not satisfy these criteria, and therefore you cannot account for the environmental benefit of your renewable energy. And this, I think, was the last slide, Rob, and then, yeah, let's take some questions.
So I would just like to touch one question, your last bullet point on this slide. Can you just touch on that and just explain that in a bit more detail? Because you said simplistically, we normally take PV theoretically at zero, you know, emissions factor times 0.95, but just use that and just talk to that one, please.
Yeah, so this goes back to an emission factor that is called the residual mix. The definition of the residual mix is the amount of CO2 emitted per megawatt hour of electricity that is not contracted specifically under contracts that limit or that specify the ownership of the environmental attributes. So say, for instance, there's a solar plant that sells its energy to a large mining house. Then you would take the emissions of the energy sector or the electricity sector in South Africa as a whole, and you would divide that by the amount of megawatt hours less the megawatt hours that is covered by that contract. So if you, let's say on the other side, we've got a solar plant or a wind plant that is selling electricity, but they have issued carbon credits on it. So they have actually split the energy from the environmental attribute. Then the energy that comes out of that wind farm and goes to a buyer, let's say it's wheeled again to a different mining house. That mining house must then account for the energy of that wind farm at the residual mixed grid emission factor. They cannot account for it at zero emissions. So if the power purchase agreement does not specify that the purchaser of the energy becomes the owner of the environmental attribute as well, then the energy that's sold from that renewable energy plant must be accounted for at the residual grid, the residual mixed grid emission factor.
Okay, and I guess at the moment with, let's leave the behind the meter growth out of the factor, because we don't have a large amount of renewables, at least from private sector, that's probably not a big delta. But when you start looking at 16,000 megs and stuff, that could be a significant impact, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it is. I've been called into another meeting, but I can wait a little bit, 5 minutes.
Cool.
Okay. So there is, and this Andrew, so I've got to complete the circle. Andrew referred to Jason and Jason referred to me, so I'll refer back to Andrew. Andrew's been doing quite a lot of work on the ownership of the environmental attribute, for instance, in the REAP program. If the power purchase agreements of the REAP program from the beginning was constructed in a way that it satisfied the quality criteria of the Scope 2 guidance document, our grid emission factor would probably have been different by somewhere between 10 and 20%. So it can make, in practice, a very big difference to the grid emission factor. And that relates to the Scope 2 emissions of the companies that then want to set net zero targets, and it can have a fairly significant impact on it. The environmental attribute of the REAP program is currently double counted because Eskom accounts for it as zero emission electricity. And quite a lot of the projects have actually sold the environmental attribute either in the form of RECs or carbon. So there's quite a lot of double counting of the environmental benefit of the REAP program that's currently happening.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. So thank you.
Can I add to that last point? It's being double counted primarily by Eskom without reference to the underlying contractual obligations that are reflected in those contracts. So you could argue this one way or the other, but so primarily Eskom is making these claims. The question that you need to ask is Eskom entitled to make those claims per its contracts?
Yes. Okay, thank you.
And Andrew's just opened up a 1-week discussion.
Yeah. PhD level
stuff. We don't have time for.
Cool. So that's where we're going to move on from that one and I see there's been a number of questions come through. I think many of the panelists have already answered some of them from what I can make out. Thank you, Jason and everyone. So I'm just going to ask for any last hands for 2 questions before we close. And if you want to put your hand up if your question hasn't been answered, and then we can quickly take 2 questions and then we'll call it. And Robbie can get to his really important golf game that they're playing. But I think, Tim, you've got a hand. Do you want to jump in and ask it, please?
Thanks very much, Rob. Hi, everyone. It's Tim Shamrock from Pyrex. Robbie, this one's for you regarding the purchase of RECs to mitigate or offset Scope 2 emissions from a reporting perspective. There was talk around the market-based accounting methodology that this represents being done away with in favor of a location-based accounting, because it's not promoting additionality. Is that something that is going to happen? Because for these big corporates that are utilizing that mechanism as a means of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions from a reporting point of view, that's going to negate that and make for a very challenging environment. So is that something that is going to happen, or is it just talk?
First of all, I'm not sure when you say there's talk of it, I'm not sure in what circles this talk is, because there are quite a lot of echo chambers in this industry. If I look at it from a fundamental perspective, and we're seeing in the echo chamber that I live in a very significant return to basics. The fundamental principle is that you cannot and should not double count the environmental benefit of renewable energy. And there are only 3 ways in which you can articulate it. So if your contracting is solid, then at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether you call this a market-based or a location-based calculation method. If you fall back on the contracting, the fundamental principles in the contracting, then you have to articulate the ownership, the legal ownership of your environmental attribute. You have to contract for the transfer of that ownership to another legal entity, and that legal entity can then account for it. So what we're advocating is forget about all the noise and the people that are saying you've got to do it like this or like this. Make sure your contract is right. And do your accounting in a way that is consistent with your legally binding agreement, and then you won't have a problem.
Understood. Thanks, Robbie.
Thank you. Any last questions before we close? Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. Apologies for the IT issues on my side and that. If you registered, you will receive the copy of the presentation and the recording, and thanks everyone for your time. And we look forward to you joining us on future webinars. There was lots of moving parts, but thank you. I think they pointed us vaguely in the right direction, sort of. Thank you, gents.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.